From 1912 to 1918, Carl Jung underwent what he termed a confrontation with the unconscious. The primary record of this period is a massive, ornate folio volume called Liber Novus, or the Red Book. Despite its aesthetic complexity, the manuscript functions as a clinical record. It is the repository for 16 years of data derived from a deliberate psychological self-experiment. Jung treated himself as the primary clinical subject. He used this desk to map an uncharted cognitive frontier, documenting his own internal processes with the same rigor he applied to his patients. The methodology began in the winter of 1913, when Jung started giving free rein to his fantasy thinking. He captured these raw occurrences immediately, noting every hallucination and internal dialogue into journals, known as the Black Books. Later, Jung translated these entries into the formal manuscript of Liber Novus, adding layers of interpretive commentary and lyrical elaboration to help contextualize the initial visions. This process effectively turned Jung's own psyche into a laboratory, where he could isolate and observe the base components of the human mind. At the time, psychotherapy was primarily concerned with the treatment of pathology, the effort to identify and cure mental illness. Through his self-observation, Jung identified a developmental trajectory in the mind, suggesting it possessed a forward-looking teleological purpose. He classified this navigation of the inner world as his confrontation with the unconscious. Documenting this period allowed analytical psychology to evolve from a medical treatment into a discipline focused on the higher development of the personality. This developmental model eventually provided the basis for what Jung called the process of individuation. The result of this 16-year observation was a structural framework designed to help individuals reach their psychological potential. This raised a foundational problem: how to systematically map the hidden layers of the mind without losing the stability of the conscious ego. This chart illustrates the first major theoretical yield of Jung's experiment, the concept of the collective unconscious. He defined it as an autonomous, shared psychological substratum separate from private memories. Within this shared substratum reside specific autonomous structures. Jung identified these universal patterns as archetypes. Because these archetypes act autonomously, they can overwhelm the conscious ego. Accessing them requires a strict clinical methodology to prevent mental collapse. Mapping these repeating patterns led Jung to the conclusion that the conscious self is only a small fraction of the total psychological structure. To safely breach the collective unconscious and engage with these forms, Jung developed a tool he called active imagination. The practice requires the subject to maintain a continuous, waking state of observation while allowing internal fantasies to unfold. Jung distinguished this from dreaming. While dreaming is passive, active imagination demands deliberate, conscious participation. He described the resulting dialogues as a form of thinking in a dramatic form. The clinician enters a direct, two-way dialogue with the symbolic manifestations and archetypes that arise in the mind's eye. Jung's objective was to derive general psychological principles from these abstract fantasies, moving beyond the purely personal experience. Active imagination provided a replicable method for psychological excavation, converting the chaos of internal visions into organized data. During his sessions, Jung considered a secondary hypothesis, that his internal visions might reflect symbolic developments occurring in the world at large. Leading up to 1914, Jung recorded a series of internal visions, characterized by extreme, overwhelming violence. With the outbreak of the First World War, the violence of the visions found a literal, external counterpart. Jung interpreted these fantasies as precognitions, suggesting his mind had anticipated the global catastrophe. To Jung, this served as evidence that the individual mind was deeply connected to macro-human events, supporting his theory of a collective unconscious. The war shifted the scope of his project. It was no longer a private inquiry, but an urgent diagnosis of the modern world's condition. Textual analysis of Liber Novus suggests a singular overarching theme: the necessity of regaining one's soul. Jung framed this struggle as a response to spiritual alienation, a malaise he saw sweeping through the early 20th century. The experiment culminated in the rebirth of a new image of God within Jung's own soul. This internal experience allowed him to develop a worldview that integrated psychological principles with a theological cosmology. For Jung, purely clinical psychology was insufficient. True healing required the integration of spiritual and mythological meaning. The completed Liber Novus stands as the definitive prototype for Jung's model of individuation. He defined individuation as the universal form of individual psychological development and integration. The timeline moved from a dangerous self-experiment in 1913 through a global war to the establishment of a formal theoretical discipline. By documenting the recovery of his own soul, Jung created a framework that integrated the spiritual and the clinical, shaping the trajectory of modern psychology.